The pride of a man who wears a holy robe is a dangerous thing. It does not announce itself loudly. It does not carry a sign. It wraps itself in scripture, perfumes itself with incense, and learns to speak in the cadence of grace, until the moment comes when it no longer needs to pretend. This is a story about that moment. Before we go any further, before we step inside those polished oak doors, before we hear the organ hum its last mournful note, I want you to close your eyes for just 1 second and think about the most trustworthy person you have ever known. Picture their face. Picture the warmth in their eyes. Now imagine discovering that warmth was a costume. That is where we begin. The morning of Arthur Pendleton's funeral arrived with the kind of gray sky that seems to understand grief. Rain threatened but had not yet fallen. The city held its breath. Westbrook Cathedral stood at the center of downtown like a crown jewel. Its white stone facade carved with angels, its stained glass windows bleeding color onto the sidewalk below. For 40 years, the cathedral had been the pride of the community, a place of refuge for the broken, a place of celebration for the restored. And for the last 12 of those 40 years, it had been the kingdom of Pastor Gerald Thomas. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, silver-templed in a way that photographers loved. His voice could drop low enough to sound like thunder rolling in from the ocean, or rise high enough to make old women weep at the rafters. People said God had given Gerald Thomas a mouth, but the devil had trained it. Nobody said that to his face, of course. On this particular morning, Pastor Thomas stood behind the pulpit in his finest black vestment, eulogizing a man he had never truly known. "Arthur Pendleton," he said, his voice settling over the packed congregation like velvet, was a man of extraordinary generosity, a man who understood that wealth is not a possession, it is a responsibility. And today we gather not only to mourn his passing, but to honor the legacy he leaves behind. The congregation murmured in agreement. Men in three-piece suits dabbed at their eyes. Women in wide-brimmed black hats bowed their heads. In the front row, Attorney Richard Sterling sat perfectly still, a leather briefcase resting against his knee. Inside that briefcase was a sealed document, the last will and testament of Arthur Pendleton, $500 million, and a set of instructions that Sterling had memorized so thoroughly he could recite them in his sleep. Pastor Thomas had memorized them too. He had paid a great deal of money to obtain a copy. As he spoke of Arthur's virtues, his philanthropy, his humility, his faith, Thomas's eyes kept drifting toward that briefcase. Just briefly. Just enough. The way a hungry man glances at a plate across the room, while pretending he isn't hungry at all. God tells us, Thomas continued, smoothing his robes, that we must love one another as he has loved us, to give, to serve, to welcome the least among us. The cathedral doors swung open. A gust of cold air swept through the pews. Heads turned. Standing in the doorway, drenched from the rain that had finally decided to fall, was a boy. He was small for 10 years old, dark-skinned, wearing a green jacket 2 sizes too large and a pair of sneakers where the right heel had completely separated from the sole, making a soft slapping sound with every step. He carried a worn backpack on both shoulders, holding the straps with both hands the way children do when they're trying to make themselves smaller. He stepped inside. The congregation stared. Pastor Thomas stopped mid-sentence. He looked at the boy the way a man looks at a pigeon that has flown into a dinner party, with a specific kind of irritation that tries to disguise itself as inconvenience. He leaned toward the microphone. His voice dropped low, still performatively gentle, still calibrated for the audience behind him. "Son," he said, "I think you may have the wrong address." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the pews. The boy did not laugh. He looked around the cathedral, at the golden altar, at the enormous portrait of Arthur Pendleton draped in black ribbon, at the white lilies stacked shoulder-high at the front, and his chin trembled slightly. "I knew Mr. Arthur," the boy said. His voice was soft but it carried. "He was kind to me." Thomas smiled. The smile did not reach his eyes. "Deacon Hayes," he said without looking away from the boy, "would you please escort our young visitor somewhere more appropriate?" Deacon Marcus Hayes was a broad man with arms like oak branches and a face that had settled, over 53 years, into a permanent expression of mild disapproval. He had served Pastor Thomas for 2 decades. He had organized fundraisers, managed building projects, quieted difficult congregation members, and never once questioned an instruction. He crossed the aisle in 6 long strides. He placed one heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. "Come on, son," he said. "Let's go." The boy looked up at him. His eyes were very dark and very steady. "I just wanted to say goodbye," he said. Hayes tightened his grip. He steered the boy toward the door. "This is not the place for you," he said quietly, as if saying it quietly made it less cruel. He pushed the door open. The boy stumbled out into the rain. The door closed behind them. Inside the cathedral, Pastor Thomas straightened his collar, smoothed his robes, and returned to his eulogy as if nothing had happened at all. "As I was saying," he said, "Arthur Pendleton was a man who believed in the dignity of every human soul." Nobody in the congregation laughed this time, but nobody said anything either. That is sometimes the louder sound. Before we follow that boy into the rain, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been turned away from a place that was supposed to welcome everyone? A church, a community, a room full of people who said one thing with their mouths and another thing with their eyes? Drop a word in the comments. Just one word. I want to know what that felt like for you. The boy sat on the bottom step of the cathedral's side entrance, backpack pulled to his chest, rain soaking through the shoulders of his oversized jacket. He didn't cry. He just sat. His name was Elijah. He was thinking about the first time he had met Arthur Pendleton. It had been a Tuesday or maybe a Wednesday, the days blurred together at the group home, and Elijah had been sitting on a park bench 3 blocks from Westbrook Cathedral eating a piece of cornbread he had saved from lunch. He'd wrapped it in a paper towel and carried it in his jacket pocket all day because he was always hungry by afternoon and the group home didn't give snacks. An old man sat down next to him. He was dressed plainly. A gray cardigan, brown trousers, shoes that had been expensive once. He smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and something warmer underneath that, something like cedar. He had a face full of soft lines and eyes the color of winter sky, pale and clear and tired. "That smells good," the old man said. Elijah looked at him. Then he looked at the cornbread. Then he tore it in half and held one piece out without saying anything. The old man looked at the cornbread. Then he looked at the boy. He was quiet for a long moment. "Son," he said finally, "do you know what I am?" Elijah shook his head. "I am the richest man in this city," the old man said. "I have 4 houses, 3 cars, and enough money in my bank accounts to buy this entire park and everything in it twice over." He took the cornbread from the boy's hand and held it gently. "And the last time someone offered me something freely with no motive, with no expectation of return, I cannot remember when that was." He ate the cornbread slowly. They sat together in silence for a while. "What's your name?" the old man asked. "Elijah." "Elijah." He nodded. "A good name. A prophet's name." He reached into his cardigan pocket and pulled out something small and dark. He pressed it into the boy's hand. "I want you to have this. I've had it a long time. I think it belongs with someone who still knows how to give without calculating the return. It was a Bible. Small, leather-bound, worn at the corners with a brass clasp on the side. Heavy in a way that felt like it contained something more than paper. "Don't open it yet," the old man said, standing slowly. "Bring it to Westbrook Cathedral on the day of my funeral. They'll know what to do." Elijah stared at him. "Are you going to die?" The old man smiled. It was a sad smile and a peaceful one at the same time. "I've been dying for 6 months," he said. "I just have a few things to arrange first." He walked away. Elijah sat with the Bible in both hands, feeling the weight of it, not understanding any of it. He didn't open it. He had promised. Now, sitting in the rain outside the cathedral where they had just thrown him out, Elijah held the straps of his backpack tighter and thought about that promise. He was still thinking about it when he heard footsteps. A woman appeared around the corner of the building, moving quickly, carrying a large black umbrella. She was perhaps 60, rosy-cheeked, round-faced, with white hair pinned back beneath a modest black hat. She wore the plain gray dress of a convent administrator, a small silver cross at her collar. Sister Martha Holt had run the Westbrook Children's Home for 18 years. She was known throughout the community as a woman of tireless compassion. She had been photographed for the diocese newsletter 11 times. She kept a framed print of the sermon on the mount above her office desk. She saw the boy and made a sound of alarm. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, opening the umbrella over him. "Oh, you poor thing. Come here." She pulled him under the umbrella with practiced warmth, rubbing his arm with her hand. She was excellent at warmth. She had spent 18 years perfecting it. "Who sent you out in this rain? Was it Hayes? That awful man." She clicked her tongue. "You come with me. I have a room in the side building where we can get you dried off." Elijah went with her. She was soft and she smelled like lavender, and the umbrella was large enough to keep him almost completely dry. She reminded him faintly of the woman who had run the first group home he'd lived in, before the transfer, a woman who had been genuinely kind. He felt his shoulders drop slightly from his ears. And here is where I need to pause, because this moment right here, a child lowering his guard for the first time in a long time, is one of the most dangerous moments in this entire story. Not the shouting, not the confrontation at the altar. This quiet moment in the rain with a warm umbrella and a soft voice. Because the people who hurt us most are rarely the ones who announce it. They are the ones who hand us the umbrella first. Have you ever trusted someone who showed you kindness before they showed you who they really were? Tell me below, because I think more of us have been in Elijah's shoes than we want to admit. She brought him to a small warm room off the cathedral's side hall, a hospitality room, with upholstered chairs and a side table set with coffee and tea things. She sat him down and bustled over to a small electric kettle. "Milk?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah said. She made him a cup of hot milk, moving efficiently, humming softly. She set it in front of him with a plate of 2 shortbread cookies. "Now," she said, sitting across from him with her hands folded neatly in her lap, "what brings you here today, sweetheart? Did you know Mr. Pendleton?" Elijah wrapped both hands around the mug. It was very warm. "He gave me something," Elijah said. "He told me to bring it here today." Martha's expression stayed gentle, but something moved behind it, quick and cold like a fish passing under still water. "How interesting," she said softly. "What did he give you?" "A Bible," Elijah said. "A small one. Old." She nodded slowly, as if she were simply processing this information with mild pastoral interest. Her hands remained perfectly still in her lap. "That sounds like Arthur," she said. "He was always giving away his little keepsakes. Very sentimental man. She tilted her head. Would you mind if I had a look at it? Just to see if it might be one I recognize from the church collection. Elijah looked at his backpack on the floor beside the chair. Something made him hesitate. He wasn't sure what. Some quiet animal instinct, the kind that children develop when they've been passed between enough hands. Maybe later, he said. I'm supposed to bring it inside myself. Martha smiled. Of course, she said. Elijah drank his milk. It was warm and sweet and slightly heavier than usual, with a faint chalky undertaste that he didn't recognize. He thought maybe it was a different kind of milk than what they had at the group home. His eyelids began to feel heavy. Martha watched him. Outside the small room, the corridor was quiet. Somewhere deeper in the building, the organ had started again, low and slow, the sound of a door being gently, firmly closed. Deacon Marcus Hayes had been in the service of Pastor Gerald Thomas for 22 years. In that time, he had never questioned a direct instruction. He had removed troublesome congregation members. He had redirected uncomfortable donation audits. He had, on 3 separate occasions, personally escorted journalists off church property before they could speak to the wrong people. He had told himself each time that he was protecting the work of God from the interference of men who did not understand it. He had believed that, or he had believed that he believed it, which is not quite the same thing. He was walking back through the side corridor after depositing the boy with Sister Martha, thinking with some discomfort about the expression on the child's face when the cathedral door had closed behind him, when he heard voices from the alcove at the corridor's end. He recognized Thomas's voice immediately. The low controlled register the pastor used when he did not want to be overheard, which was different from his public voice the way a blade is different from its sheath. Hayes slowed his steps. The Bible has a false panel in the back cover, Thomas was saying. Arthur told me about it years ago when we were still on speaking terms. The will document is inside. If we get that Bible before Sterling reads the original, we control the narrative. And the boy. Martha's voice. Calm. Professional. The boy is 10 years old and lives in a group home. He doesn't understand what he's carrying. Just get it from him. The milk should have him drowsy within 20 minutes. Be gentle about it. I don't want a scene. And my arrangement? 2 million, Thomas said. Wired by Friday. You have my word. A pause. You have always been practical, Martha, he said. I've always liked that about you. Hayes stood very still in the corridor. He counted his own heartbeats for a moment. 5, 6, 7. A habit he had developed years ago when difficult information needed a moment to settle before he could act on it usefully. He had learned it from his father, who had been a man of few words and considerable internal discipline, and who had told him once that the space between hearing and responding was the only space a man truly owned. He had known, on some level, the way you know about a smell in a building before you can identify its source, that things were not entirely clean, that certain large donations had been redirected, that the new cathedral extension had been budgeted at 3 times what comparable construction would cost, that some of the families who had tithed their savings had never seen the programs they were funding materialize. He had told himself it was complexity, administrative overhead, the inevitable gap between intention and execution in any large organization. He had not told himself that it was a man stealing from grieving people for 20 years, because if he had said it plainly like that, he would have been required to do something about it. The particular calculus of complicity, Hayes understood it well enough now, standing in that corridor with the sound of Thomas's voice still in the air, to name it accurately. It is not that good people look away from evil because they do not see it. It is that they look away because seeing it fully obligates them, and obligation is expensive, and they have built lives that cannot easily afford the cost. He thought about the families. Mrs. Coretta James, 71 years old, who tithed 15% of her Social Security check every month without fail, who had told Hayes 2 years ago with unshakable confidence that the grief counseling ministry had helped her through her husband's death. She had not known, Hayes had not told her, that the grief counseling ministry had been operating on volunteer labor for 3 years because its dedicated budget had been quietly absorbed elsewhere. He had told himself that the ministry still functioned, that people were still being helped, that the outcome justified the ambiguity of the funding trail. He thought about Brother Damien, who had organized the children's after-school tutoring program out of his own salary as a high school teacher, driving across town 3 nights a week, paying for supplies out of pocket, under the impression that the church reimbursement process was simply slow. It was not slow. The funds had been redirected to a communications consulting contract that happened to share a mailing address with Thomas's personal attorney. Hayes had processed that invoice personally. He had told himself he did not have the full picture. He had the full picture now. He stood in the corridor and thought about the boy's face. The way he had held the backpack straps with both hands, making himself smaller. The practiced self-compression of a child who has learned that taking up too much space invites consequences. The way he had said, "I just wanted to say goodbye," and meant it with every unguarded cell in his body. The sentence of someone who has not yet learned to want things strategically. Hayes had a granddaughter. She was 8. She had the same quality, that complete inability to perform an emotion she wasn't actually feeling. She cried when she was sad and laughed when she was happy, and when she was angry she said so plainly and without diplomatic softening, which sometimes caused difficulties at school and which Hayes had, until very recently, considered something she would eventually learn to manage. He thought now that perhaps it was something else. Perhaps it was the last clean thing. He thought about what it would cost him to walk through that door. The position, the title, the community standing that he had built over 2 decades and that had become, without his fully noticing, the primary structure around which his sense of self was organized. He was Deacon Hayes. He was the man Thomas trusted. He was the man the congregation knew. If he walked through that door and did what needed doing, he would be something else, something without a title yet, without a clear shape. He thought about his granddaughter. I want you to sit with this for just a second. Hayes is standing in a hallway. Nobody is watching him. Nobody will ever know which way he turns. He can walk back to the service and keep his title, his reputation, his 22 years of standing, or he can walk through that door and blow everything up to protect a boy he met 40 minutes ago. This is the question I want you to think about right now, and I genuinely want your answer in the comments. When the cost of doing the right thing is something you have spent your whole life building, do you still do it? He moved. He did not knock on the hospitality room door. He opened it. Martha was at the chair beside Elijah, her hand reaching slowly toward the backpack on the floor. The boy's eyes were half closed, his head beginning to list toward his shoulder. Martha looked up. Her expression was, for just one fraction of a second, completely unguarded, animal panic quickly suppressed. "Marcus," she said smoothly. "I was just." Hayes crossed the room in 4 steps. He picked up the mug of milk from the side table and set it on the far counter, away from the boy. Then he crouched down in front of Elijah and put a hand on the boy's knee. "Hey," he said. Stay with me." Elijah blinked. "I'm tired," he said. "I know. Keep your eyes open for me." Hayes looked up at Martha. His voice was quiet. "Whatever was in that milk, how much did he get?" Martha straightened. Her expression rearranged itself into dignity. I don't know what you're implying. How much? Hayes said again, the same volume, no louder, which was somehow more serious than shouting. She pressed her lips together. A small amount. He'll be groggy for an hour. It won't harm him. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. 18 years he had known this woman. He had sat across from her at Easter dinners. He had taken a collection for her building renovation fund. He had told his granddaughter that Sister Martha was an example of Christian service. Get out of this room, he said. Marcus, Pastor Thomas specifically. I heard what Pastor Thomas specifically, Hayes said. Get out of this room. She got out of the room. Hayes pulled a chair around to face Elijah and sat in it. He kept his hand on the boy's knee, steady pressure and anchor. You doing okay? He said. Elijah nodded slowly. His eyes were clearer now, fighting through the fog. He had a stubbornness about him that Hayes was beginning to recognize. The Bible, Elijah said. He hugged the backpack tighter to his chest. I didn't give it to her. I know, Hayes said. You hold on to it. Don't give it to anyone but the lawyer in the black suit. You understand. Elijah looked at him, searched his face the way children search adult faces, thoroughly, without embarrassment, looking for the truth beneath the performance. Apparently he found something satisfactory because he nodded. Okay, he said. Hayes stood. He had not made a decision exactly. He was not a man who made decisions so much as a man who eventually ran out of room to keep postponing them. He picked up the backpack from the floor and held it out to the boy. Come on, he said. We're going back inside. The cathedral had settled into the portion of the service reserved for the reading of the will. It was unusual to include this in the funeral ceremony itself, but Arthur Pendleton had been an unusual man, and his instructions had been very specific. Attorney Richard Sterling stood at the lectern, his posture precise, his silver reading glasses perched at the end of his nose. He had done this before, the theater of grief and inheritance, and he was very good at managing both simultaneously. Arthur Pendleton was a man, Sterling said, who spent the last year of his life engaged in a very particular kind of accounting. Not financial accounting, though that was part of it. Something more personal. He asked me, as his attorney and his friend of 30 years, to structure the disbursement of his estate in a manner that reflected his conclusions. He paused and looked out over the congregation. He left behind a specific document, handwritten, notarized, and sealed inside a personal keepsake. He specified that the keepsake would be brought to this ceremony by the person he had entrusted with it. And that person, Sterling said, would read the contents aloud. To everyone. The congregation shifted, rustled, exchanged glances. In the front pew, Pastor Thomas sat with his hands folded on his knees, and his expression composed into the dignified grief of a man who fully expected to be named principal beneficiary within the next 5 minutes. He had dressed for this. He had prepared remarks for after. He had, in fact, already mentally allocated $40 million of the anticipated bequest to a renovation of his personal residence in Calabasas, which he planned to describe in press materials as a pastoral retreat and ministry center. He waited. Sterling looked toward the side entrance of the cathedral. I believe our designated reader has arrived, he said. The heavy oak door at the side of the sanctuary opened. Deacon Hayes walked in first. He was a large man and he moved with the deliberate gravity of someone who has made a decision and stopped second-guessing it. Behind him, holding his hand, came Elijah, still in the oversized green jacket, still in the shoes with the separated heel, his dark eyes moving carefully over the sea of faces turning toward him. The congregation went very still. Pastor Thomas's composed expression shifted almost imperceptibly, tightening at the jaw, a slight flattening of the eyes. The kind of micro-movement that only people who have been watching powerful men for a long time would notice. He rose from his pew and moved into the aisle. "What is the meaning of this?" he said, his voice pitched at the register of benevolent authority being unjustly disturbed. "This child has no business here. He was already removed once." "He has every business here," Sterling said from the lectern. "Sit down, Gerald." Thomas blinked. Sterling had never called him Gerald. He had always been Pastor Thomas. The absence of the title landed like a hand on a shoulder in the dark. Thomas did not sit down. He stepped toward Hayes and the boy, and his hand came up, a quick, sharp motion, the kind of motion that people who have never been held accountable develop over decades of not being held accountable. Hayes moved between them. He took the blow on his own forearm, took it without flinching, stood there with it the way a wall stands without opinion. The congregation gasped. Someone in the back said "Lord" out loud. Thomas looked at his own hand as if it had done something surprising. For one unguarded moment his face showed something true, not rage but fear. The fear of a man who has just moved faster than his mask. He stepped back. He smoothed his robes. He tried to reconstruct the mask, but the congregation had seen the face beneath it, and faces seen cannot be unseen. Hayes looked at Thomas for a long moment. Then he walked Elijah to the front of the cathedral. At the lectern, Sterling crouched down to the boy's level. "You're Elijah," he said quietly. "Yes, sir. Arthur told me about you," Sterling said. "He described you very specifically. He said, you'll know him because he'll be the only one there who came to say goodbye instead of to get something." He straightened. "Do you have the Bible he gave you?" Elijah unzipped his backpack. He reached inside and pulled out the small leather-bound Bible, worn at the corners with its brass clasp on the side. He held it out to Sterling. Sterling shook his head gently. "It's yours," he said. "You read it." That was Arthur's instruction. Elijah looked at the Bible in his hands. He looked out at the hundreds of faces in the pews, people in expensive clothes with complicated expressions, people who had looked at him in the doorway like he was something that had blown in off the street. He looked at Deacon Hayes standing beside him. Hayes gave him a single nod. "This is the moment." Everything that has happened, the cornbread on the park bench, the rain outside the cathedral door, the drugged milk, the hand raised to strike a child, 22 years of a man pretending not to see. It all comes down to a 10-year-old boy standing at an altar holding a worn leather Bible. Before he opens it, I want you to make a prediction. What do you think Arthur Pendleton wrote in that letter? What would you write if you were a dying man with $500 million and a lifetime of watching people use God's name to take from the poor? Put your answer below. Then keep listening. Elijah opened the brass clasp. He turned to the back cover. There was a small folded piece of paper tucked into the inside back panel, just as Sterling had known it would be. Elijah unfolded it carefully, like someone who has learned to handle things other people throw away. He looked at the handwriting. It was large and slightly shaky, old handwriting, the kind that has written a million things and is running out of time for them. He read. His voice was soft at first, and then it found itself. "My name is Arthur James Pendleton, and this is my last confession." The cathedral was so quiet that the candles along the altar seemed audible, their small flames pressing against the silence. "I have spent 50 years building wealth and 30 years giving portions of it away, and I thought that the second thing balanced the first. I have learned close to the end that it does not. Generosity calculated for reputation is not generosity. It is advertising. I have also spent 30 years attending Westbrook Cathedral, and 12 of those years watching a man use the name of God to build a personal empire while the people who trusted him went without. I have documentation. I have bank records. I have a separate sealed package delivered today to the offices of the district attorney that details in full the financial misconduct of Pastor Gerald Thomas over the past 10 years, funds diverted from the homeless ministry, from the children's education program, from the building fund, from the grief counseling service. $15 million, give or take, from people who had far less than he did and gave what they had because they believed someone was keeping it safe. The sealed package also includes something I have kept for 40 years. A letter Gerald Thomas wrote to me when we were young men and he needed a loan to start his ministry. In that letter he wrote that he had no use for the poor except as proof that God favors the disciplined. He was 28 when he wrote it. He has spent 40 years since then proving he meant it. I say all of this not with malice but with grief. I wished it were different. I prayed it would become different. It did not. As for my estate, $500 million is to be placed in the Arthur Pendleton Foundation for Children, to be administered by a board of independent trustees appointed by Sterling and Associates, dedicated in perpetuity to the welfare, education, and dignified care of children in the foster and orphan care system of this state. I leave nothing to Westbrook Cathedral under its current administration. I leave nothing to Pastor Gerald Thomas except the hope, which I hold genuinely and with some effort, that whatever remains of the boy who once had principles finds its way back to the surface before he runs out of time to use it. To Elijah, you gave half a piece of cornbread to a stranger on a park bench. You didn't calculate whether he deserved it. You didn't ask what you would get in return. You just gave it the way humans were perhaps originally designed to do before we learned better. I have thought about that moment almost every day since. It is, I think, the most purely good thing anyone has ever done for me. This Bible belonged to my mother. She would have liked you. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. That is all there is in the end.
Arthur J. Pendleton.
Elijah folded the paper. His hands were steady now. He looked up. The cathedral was completely silent for 3 full seconds, the kind of silence that is not emptiness but accumulation, every person in the room absorbing at their own pace what had just been said. Then it broke. Not with applause or shouting. It broke with sound, the sound of people turning to each other, the sound of a woman near the back beginning to cry, the sound of several men in the front pews beginning to speak at once, the sound of a building full of people realizing all at the same time that they had been wrong about something they had organized a large portion of their lives around. A man in the third row, heavy-set, mid-60s, in a dark suit that had been carefully pressed, put both his hands flat on the back of the pew in front of him and lowered his head. His name was Harold Briggs. He was a deacon emeritus of the congregation and had personally organized the annual charity auction for 11 consecutive years, raising a combined total of close to $400,000, all of it directed through Pastor Thomas's discretionary ministry fund. He sat with his hands flat on that pew for a long time and did not look up. Beside him, his wife Patricia turned to look at the front of the cathedral with an expression that was not grief exactly and not rage exactly but something between them, the particular expression of a woman who has trusted her instincts, had them seconded by someone she trusted more, and is now discovering that the seconding was fraudulent. She had told her sister 2 years ago that Pastor Thomas was one of the genuinely good ones. Her sister had been skeptical. Patricia had been sure. In the middle section of the pews, a younger woman, perhaps 30, natural hair, a 2-year-old daughter asleep across her lap, looked at Elijah standing at the front of the cathedral and pressed her lips together hard. Her name was Camille. She had come to Westbrook Cathedral during one of the worst years of her life and found something that felt like solid ground. She had given the church more than she could afford because Thomas had said specifically that the children's education fund was his personal priority. She had wanted her daughter to grow up knowing that communities kept their word. She looked at the sleeping child in her lap, then back at Elijah. She was the first one to stand. She did not applaud. She simply stood, in the middle of the congregation. In the middle of the silence, 2-year-old daughter shifted to her shoulder and looked at the boy at the front of the cathedral with an expression that was uncomplicated and clear. If this story is landing with you the way I think it is, if you are thinking about someone in your own life who wore an umbrella of warmth and had something else underneath, or about a Deacon Hayes you once knew or wish you had known, hit the like button right now. Not for the algorithm, just as a way of saying I see what this story is about and it matters. And if you are watching this and you are not yet subscribed, this is the kind of story we tell here every week. Stay with us. A man across the aisle stood next. Then 2 women in the row behind him. Then, progressively, unevenly, the way standing spreads through crowds when it is genuine and not performed, more people rose to their feet. Not all of them. Perhaps 2/3. The remaining third stayed seated, some out of shock, some out of a stubbornness that would take longer to work through, some because they were genuinely unsure what they were being asked to feel and preferred to wait until they knew. At the front, Elijah watched all of this with the careful attention of someone who has had to learn to read rooms quickly and whose survival has depended on reading them accurately. He did not fully understand what he was seeing. He understood that it was large and that it was directed at him and that it was not hostile, which in his experience was not something he could always take for granted in rooms full of people who looked like the people in this room. He looked at Hayes, who was standing 2 feet to his left. Hayes was looking at the congregation with an expression Elijah couldn't entirely name. It was not quite pride. It was not quite grief. It was something that might have been the feeling of watching the thing you always hoped was true about people turn out to be, against the odds, actually true. What do I do? Elijah said quietly. Hayes looked down at him. Nothing, he said. You already did it. At the far side of the cathedral in the south transept, 3 women from the grief counseling ministry had found each other and gathered in a corner. Arms linked, voices low and urgent. They were the ones who had been running the ministry on volunteer hours for 3 years, who had driven to hospitals and sat in waiting rooms and held hands with strangers in the dark hours after diagnosis, after accident, after loss. They had done this without complaint and without the reimbursement they had been promised because they believed the money was simply delayed, that Thomas would sort it, that the work mattered more than the accounting. They were not crying. They were making a list. On the back of a funeral program, one of them, a retired schoolteacher named Dolores, was writing down names. The names of every family she could remember who had come through the grief ministry and given more than they should have and been told the church was covering their needs. The list was already 12 names long, and she had only been writing for 2 minutes. We bring this to the foundation, she said quietly to the others. All of it. Everything we know. Arthur set it up to fix exactly this. She pressed her pen to the paper with a firmness that suggested she had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this kind of task. We start Monday. Pastor Gerald Thomas had not moved. He was standing in the center aisle where Hayes had blocked him, and he was standing very still, and the color had left his face in the way that color leaves a face when the body redirects all available blood to the emergency management of shock. His lips were slightly parted. His hands, which had been building to fists, had gone slack. He had not anticipated the letter. He had seen a copy of the will, or what he believed to be a copy, obtained at considerable expense, And it had made no mention of documentation delivered to the district attorney. It had made no mention of a 40-year-old letter in Thomas's own handwriting. The copy he had paid for had been, he now understood, a version Arthur Pendleton had prepared specifically for him to find. A version without the teeth. Arthur had known for years perhaps, and had waited, with what must have been extraordinary patience, the patience of a man who has accepted that certain things take the time they take, for exactly this moment. The feeling that moved through Thomas in the seconds after Elijah finished reading was not one he could easily categorize. It was not simply fear, though fear was part of it. It was not simply shame, though that was there too, working its way up from somewhere deep and long suppressed. It was something larger and harder to name, the feeling of a structure collapsing, not brick by brick but all at once, the way buildings fall in controlled demolition. Suddenly, completely leaving nothing standing where the thing had been. His knees bent slightly, then more. He reached for the end of a pew, missed it, sat down hard on the aisle step, and sat there with his hands in his lap and his vestments around him and his face the face of a man who had spent 40 years arranging the furniture of his own mythology, and has just come home to find the house empty. The room continued to expand around him as if he were shrinking. 2 police officers who had been asked by Sterling to attend the reading stepped forward from where they had been waiting near the back. At the far side of the cathedral, Sister Martha was moving toward the door with her particular quality of efficient invisibility, the walk of a woman accustomed to leaving rooms before the questions start. She had not counted on Hayes having sent a 3rd officer to the side entrance. She stopped when she saw the uniform. Her face went through 3 expressions very quickly. Then it settled into something dignified and slightly martyred, which was the one she had the most practice with. It did not help her today. They took Pastor Thomas out through the side entrance. He walked on his own. He had recovered enough of himself to prefer that, to walk rather than be carried, to maintain the form of dignity even when the substance of it was gone. The 2 officers walked on either side of him, not touching him. Not yet. There would be time for the formal procedures at the station, the reading of rights, the processing, the photographs. Here, in the corridor of the cathedral he had presided over for 12 years, they gave him the small courtesy of not making it physical. Perhaps they understood, without discussing it, that the walk itself was its own kind of judgment. That every step he took through this corridor, past the framed photographs of congregational events, baptisms, confirmations, Christmas celebrations, the building groundbreaking where he stood in the center with a golden shovel grinning, was a sentence being read aloud. He did not look at the photographs. He looked straight ahead, the way a man looks when he is trying to sustain a version of himself that is already gone. One of the officers pushed open the side door. Cold air came in. Thomas stepped through it and stopped for a moment on the landing, looking out at the ordinary afternoon. The parked cars, the pigeons on the low wall across the street, a group of teenagers passing on the sidewalk without any idea that something significant had just happened 30 feet from them. He had come to this cathedral for the first time 31 years ago, as a young minister with an invitation to speak at a guest service. He had stood in the pulpit and looked out at the congregation and felt something shift in him, a recognition, a settling of ambition into a specific shape. He had wanted this. The building, the platform, the assembled trust. He had wanted it so much that he had gradually stopped asking himself what it was for. That was the honest account of it. Not malice exactly. Not some cackling cartoon villainy. Just want, and the slow, comfortable habit of not examining want too closely when it was being consistently satisfied. Just a man who had begun with a genuine purpose and then, increment by increment over years and decades, had renegotiated the terms of that purpose until it was unrecognizable, and had never noticed any single moment in which the renegotiation was clearly, unambiguously wrong. That was the thing about erosion. It did not announce itself. It happened in the small decisions, in the redirected line items, in the corners cut and the questions not followed up on, and the faces of people like Mrs. Coretta James, who had given and trusted, and whom he had looked at Sunday after Sunday with performed warmth and not once lost sleep over. He thought about Arthur Pendleton, about that letter he had written at 28, the one Arthur had kept for 40 years. He remembered writing it, vaguely, the way you remember things from a time when you were a person you no longer are. He remembered the impatience behind it, the contempt he had felt for the poverty he was supposed to be ministering to, the way it slowed everything down, the way it complicated the vision he had for what his ministry could become. He had never thought Arthur read that letter as carefully as it deserved. He thought about the boy, about the size of him, about the broken shoe making that small sound on the cathedral floor, about the way the boy had looked at him when he tried to have him removed, not with fear, not with deference, but with a kind of patient witnessing that Thomas had found, to his surprise and discomfort, more unsettling than any challenge from an equal. Children who have not yet learned to pretend are, for people who have made a career of pretending, deeply uncomfortable to be around. He had sensed this without understanding it, and he had reacted to it the way he reacted to most things he didn't want to examine, by removing them from his vicinity. The officer touched his elbow gently. Time to move. Thomas walked down the steps. He did not look back at the cathedral door. He was not yet at the place where looking back would be useful, where the distance would provide something other than pain. That would come perhaps, or perhaps it would not. In the cathedral behind him, the congregation was still there, still sorting through what had happened, still becoming whatever they would become on the other side of this afternoon. Hayes watched him go. He thought about 22 years, about the ways a person rationalizes themselves from one place to another so gradually they don't notice the distance, about how conviction works, how you can hold a genuine belief and a convenient one at the same time in the same hand without feeling the contradiction, until the moment you do. He did not know what would happen to him next. He assumed the cathedral's board would have questions. He assumed his role as deacon was effectively over. He found to his surprise that this felt more like relief than like loss. He looked down. Elijah was standing next to him, holding the leather Bible in both arms, watching the door through which Thomas had just disappeared. "Is he going to jail?" Elijah asked. "I think so," Hayes said. "Yes." The boy nodded. He appeared to be processing this the way children process difficult information, not with the adult impulse to immediately place it into a moral framework, but simply looking at it, turning it around, accepting the weight of it. "He was scared," Elijah said. Hayes looked at him. "How do you mean?" "When he came at us," Elijah said, "he wasn't angry. He was scared." He looked up at Hayes. Angry people look big. Scared people just look loud. Hayes was quiet for a moment. "That is a very true thing," he said finally. Sterling appeared beside them, coat on, briefcase in hand. He put his hand briefly on Elijah's shoulder. "There are people from the foundation who want to meet you," he said. "When you're ready. Norus. There will be a proper process." Arthur set it up carefully, but he specifically asked that you be consulted, to the extent that's possible, on how the children's programs are structured. He paused. He believed you would have useful things to say. Elijah looked up at him. "I'm 10, he said. "I know," Sterling said. "Arthur said to tell you that the people who build things worth building usually start when they're too young to know any better." He almost smiled. His words. Elijah looked back down at the Bible. He ran his thumb along the worn edge of the leather cover. His mother's Bible, Arthur had said, given to the one person who still knew how to give without keeping score. The congregation was still in the pews, some talking quietly, some sitting in their own thoughts. Some of the women from the grief support ministry gathered together in a corner, their voices low and urgent. The organs were silent. The candles continued to burn. The cathedral was the same building it had been 2 hours ago. The stone was the same. The angels carved into the facade outside were the same. The stained glass bled the same colors onto the same floor. And yet, Hayes put his large hand briefly on top of Elijah's head. Not patting. Just resting there, the way you rest your hand on something to confirm it is real. "You did good," he said. Elijah looked up at him. "So did you," the boy said. They walked out of the cathedral together, the old deacon and the boy in the broken shoes, into the afternoon, where the rain had finally stopped and the sun was doing what it does after storms, returning to the world as if it had only been away a moment, as if it had never doubted it would come back. The city continued around them. Buses, pigeons, a woman pushing a stroller, a man on the corner selling flowers. Elijah carried the Bible in both arms. He did not look back. There are things worth carrying forward, and things worth leaving in rooms where the doors close behind you. Knowing the difference, that is the whole of it, really. That is everything. The last thing Arthur Pendleton had given to the world was not money. It was this. A boy walking out of a cathedral on a Tuesday afternoon, holding a book that had belonged to a woman who knew how to love without conditions, ready, unhurried, unbroken, unimpressed by any of it, to figure out what comes next. There is one more thing worth knowing about Arthur Pendleton, not for the story exactly but for the truth of it which the story deserves. When Gerald Thomas was 24 years old and sleeping in a rented room above a laundromat in the South End, he had a dream, a genuine one. He wanted to build a church that would be a sanctuary for the people the city forgot. He wrote about it constantly, in letters, in journals, in the margins of his seminary textbooks. He had a quality back then that everyone who knew him remembered. When he spoke about the work, his face changed. It became young in a way that had nothing to do with his actual age. It became true. Arthur Pendleton met him at that time. He was impressed enough to give the young man a loan, no interest, no collateral, to rent a small storefront and begin his ministry. He believed in what he saw in Thomas's face. For 7 years, the church Thomas built was exactly what he had dreamed of. Fed people. It housed people temporarily in a building Thomas had arranged to borrow on weekends from a sympathetic property owner. It sat with people in their grief without telling them their grief was a failure of faith. It was, by any reasonable measure, good. Then the city noticed it. Then the donors came. Then the diocese came. Then the newspaper features came and the photographs and the awards dinners and the speaking invitations. And somewhere in the passage from small to celebrated, Thomas lost the thread. Not all at once.
Z beat Z.
Season by season. The way everything genuine is at risk of becoming its own caricature when enough people decide to look at it. Arthur watched this happen over 30 years and said nothing, because he was also becoming his own caricature in his own way, and he did not feel he had the standing. What he felt in the last months of his life was not satisfaction at exposing a corrupt man. He felt something more like sorrow, the specific sorrow of watching someone waste the best version of themselves. He had hoped until very nearly the end that Thomas might find his way back to that storefront, to that face. He had written in his private journal 2 weeks before he died, "I believe in redemption in theory. In practice I have found it rarer than I was led to expect. But I have found it. It shows up in unlikely vessels. A boy on a bench. Half a piece of cornbread. The ordinary sacrament of noticing another person is hungry and doing something about it without making a speech. He had died on a Monday. Peacefully. In his own bed, with the window open and the sound of rain on the street below. He had been, in the end, a man who spent most of his life learning what he should have known at the beginning. That is perhaps the most common human story there is. And perhaps the most forgivable. Westbrook Cathedral did not close. The board appointed an interim pastor, a woman named Reverend Diane Cole, who had spent 15 years running a food pantry out of a church basement in the East Side and who had been turned down for the head pastor role at Westbrook twice, both times by Thomas, both times without explanation. She removed the large portrait of Arthur Pendleton from the wall on her first day. She replaced it with a plain wooden cross and a framed index card on which she had written in her own handwriting, "Come in. Sit down. You're welcome here." The response to the new administration from the community was cautious at first, then curious, then, gradually, something that looked like the beginning of trust. Deacon Hayes stayed on. He managed the building. He organized the volunteers. He did not preach and did not want to. He brought his granddaughter on the first Saturday of every month to help with the children's program, a program funded, as of that spring, by the first distribution from the Arthur Pendleton Foundation. Hayes's granddaughter was 8 years old and had the quality he had always noticed in her, the inability to perform an emotion she wasn't actually feeling. She showed up and she gave what she had and she did not calculate the return. She and Elijah met on one of those Saturdays. They argued almost immediately about something, the correct rules to a card game, or who was faster around the building's perimeter, the record for which Elijah claimed with some controversy. The argument was energetic and completely without malice. They became, over the following year, close friends, which Arthur Pendleton, who had arranged so many things so carefully, had not arranged. Simply happened. The way the best things do, without orchestration, without intention, in the space between what we plan and what grace delivers. Elijah kept the Bible. He kept it on the small shelf above his bed in the group home, and then in his room in the foster family he was placed with 8 months later, a family who had been matched to him through a reformed process that was part of the Foundation's first structural initiative, and who turned out improbably to be exactly what had been hoped for. He grew up. Of course he did. The way all of them grow up, faster than they should have to, slower than they feel like they're going, surprised eventually by what they become. But that is another story. This one ends here. A boy. A book. A bench in a city park. Half a piece of cornbread offered freely, with nothing held back and nothing held in reserve. The rest was already written. And so I leave you with the only question that matters after a story like this one. What is the smallest generous thing you could do today, not for recognition, not for return, not because someone is watching, but just because another person is there and they are hungry and you happen to have something to give? Tell me what you're thinking in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, share it with one person who needs to hear it today. That is how stories like this travel. Not through algorithms, through hands. Thank you for being here. I'll see you in the next one.